Hello, everyone. So today I will be covering chapter 17, which we're still in that Gilded Age. We've talked a lot about what's going on really on the East Coast and up north. This chapter is like the meanwhile out west and in the South chapter. So it's during the same time period. It's still that Gilded Age, 1865 to 1900. It's just the other parts of the country that we haven't really been looking at. So, as white settlers are moving west, they are going to clash with Native Americans that are there. So this is beginning way back with Manifest Destiny and the Oregon Trail and people moving to California. So white settlers that move west spread disease. Another problem is they are hurting the bison population, which a lot of these Great Plains Native tribes rely on bison herds. They follow them throughout the plains. They're nomadic for their way of life. So there's a series of treaties. This began way back with Andrew Jackson in the Trail of Tears, where he had them walk to what is now Oklahoma, to the Indian Territory. In the 1850s, we're going to see a series of other treaties signed between the U.S. government and Native tribes, giving them a reservation, so an area of land that they are supposed to stay on. The idea is they will be left alone, provided with food, provisions. There won't be these clashes. But inevitably, that doesn't work out like they were hoping. Many of them don't stay within their boundary because they're following the bison herd, so there's clashes. There's warfare between American troops and Native Americans, many of which are extremely gruesome and bloody. This is not one of the high points of American history. It's kind of tough to talk about some of this stuff. So we call these the Indian Wars. It's just a series of clashes out west between U.S. military forces, militias, and Native tribes living on the land. So the first one, Sand Creek Massacre, this one, pretty gruesome. Around 400 Native Americans are killed, including women and children. So that's why it's called a massacre. This is an American militia, and 400 are killed. In retaliation for that, Native Americans attack white troops at the Bozeman Trail and end up killing and mutilating the bodies of 81 soldiers. So there's one instance, just to give you an idea, one of the corpses that they found had 105 arrows to his face. So there is gruesome stuff going on both sides of this during these Indian Wars. Probably one of the most famous battles, one you may have heard of, the Battle of Little Bighorn. So that's Colonel Custer against the Sioux chief, so the Sioux Indians led by Sitting Bull. All of Custer's troops are wiped out. He is killed in the battle. That's why it's also known as Custer's Last Stand, but probably one of the most significant and well-known of these Indian War battles. That is Geronimo. I'm sure you've heard of him as well. So by the end of all of this, and we will talk about Wounded Knee as like the last major battle, the American government is starting to figure out that the natives would be cheaper to feed than fight. That's like the quote they used, that we could stop all this fighting, just put them on reservations and provide the things that they need. That would be easier than what we're doing right now. So all of these factors are going to be detrimental to the native populations. Railroads cutting into their land, disease we know from the beginning has been a major impact, and then introduction of alcohol, firearms, all of those have negative effects on these native tribes that are still living out west. So the bison, we said they're extremely important. They use them for everything. So they use them for food. They burn buffalo chips for fuel. They use the hides for clothing. So just to give you an estimate, and these pictures are kind of hard to look at too. 1868, right at the end of the Civil War, there are estimated to be 15 million buffalo or bison on the frontier. By 1885, there are less than 1,000. So it's kind of amazing that they didn't go extinct, that they still exist. If you've ever gone to like Yellowstone, you may have seen them before. They're massive. But they almost go extinct. And part of the reason for this is these men who are moving west, on riding on trains, they would shoot them just for sport, like it was a game. There's all this greed and waste. You can tell from these pictures, this guy is sitting on top of hides. So think like one hide is really thin. That's how many are stacked on top of each other. And then this one is almost unreal to look at. These are skulls. So the guy up here is holding one skull, and he's on a mountain of buffalo skulls. So there's just excessive amounts of waste, and they're really ruining the way of life of these native tribes who rely on the buffalo for everything. So there are some people who start to raise awareness about these abuses that are going on out west. A really important book, it's a red term, so make sure you put a star by it, is a best-selling book by Helen Hunt Jackson called Century of Dishonor, where she's attempting to expose some of these things that have been going on that a lot of average Americans had no idea about. The last of the battles is called Battle of Wounded Knee. It's not even really a battle because the natives don't even really fight back. 200 are killed. Images from this are pretty grotesque. These are bodies that were frozen on the ground after this massacre. This marks the end of the Indian Wars, though. After this battle, we don't see any other major, what we would call battles between the two sides. After this, we have the Dawes Act, another red term. The way you can remember this, the Dawes Act divided up the native lands. So they're going to take Native American lands, divide it into 160-acre plots to allow the nuclear families of the Native American tribes to live on that land. This is an attempt to make them more American, which, you know, this is totally against the way of life of most of these tribes. They don't even understand the concept of property ownership. You just follow the buffalo herds. It's not like this is my land, that is your land, but that's what they're trying to do. So they say, here's 160 acres for your family, 160 acres for your family. They also set up schools. They try to teach them skills. They try to Christianize the natives. These are attempts at making them Americanized. That's what that assimilation, blend them into American culture instead of just trying to kill them off. So know the Dawes Act for sure. Also, the land that was not given to Native American families is sold off for profit. So yes, the government is profiting off of this as well. Meanwhile, there are more settlers moving west. So we know they found gold in California in 48 and the 49ers flocked out there. They find gold in Colorado in 59. So people dash out to Colorado. There's these mining towns for gold and silver all throughout the West, Nevada, Colorado, Utah. So that's where we get these ghost towns that have saloons and duels out in the street, whatever else, that all the people flock there to mine. Once all the ore is exhausted, they leave and it turns into a ghost town. And I can't remember the name of this one, but it still exists. Like, these are current pictures that you can go visit of this old mining town in Nevada that's still there and set up how it was back in the day. So kind of cool to look at. Just like with everything else, we'll talk about this with farming as well. It's the era of industrialization. So corporations, big machinery start to replace just the little guy with his sifter pan for mining. So men and women that move out west do have quite a bit of opportunity. A lot of women are going to be more independent out there and able to hold jobs and do have rights that they wouldn't have been able to have back in eastern cities. So Wyoming is the first state to give women the right to vote, well before the 19th Amendment is going to be passed in 1920. So 1869, they are the first. There's a good trivia question for you. First state to give women the right to vote is Wyoming. Also, all this silver that they're digging up, we'll talk about this a couple chapters from now. It's going to be a big currency issue to where people are calling for silver to be used for our currency instead of gold or with gold. So instead of just the gold standard, they want gold and silver. It's called bimetallism. And that's because we're mining all of this silver out west. So keep that in mind for the future. In California, there are going to be some ethnic clashes. So the main two groups of immigrants working on mining, but also the Transcontinental Railroad that is completed in 1869, are Irish and Chinese immigrants. So if you think about it, West Coast is closest to Asia. So many Chinese immigrants are coming into California to work on the railroad and mining. There's discrimination. It's many of the same anti-immigrant arguments you hear today are what they were saying in the 1880s, that they're taking jobs, they're willing to work for less than white wage earners, than Irish workers. So there's a lot of discrimination. There's a group called the Kearneyites that were like kind of like the KKK, but targeting Chinese immigrants in California. They would commit violence, they would cut off their hair, things like that. So in 1882, Congress passes the first law banning an entire group from immigrating to the United States. It's called the Chinese Exclusion Act. So because of this, no more Chinese immigrants can move to the United States. There were exceptions for certain things like education or doctors, things like that. But if you were just an average Chinese worker trying to come to California to work in a mine, you were excluded. You could not come to the United States. So meanwhile, back south, I guess, if we're kind of toward the Texas area, back to the Great Plains, Texas Longhorns, this is where the cowboys are going to come in. So the beef industry is really going to explode at this point. Part of the reason for that is railroads make it possible to move animals, to move meat. Refrigerated cars are a game changer because now you can transport food without it spoiling in a matter of days. So the cattle drive that I feel like there's 8 million Western movies about, even though this period didn't really last all that long, is where they're marching all the cattle toward the railroad terminal. That's what the cattle drive, the long drive, is. There's a few factors that end this open range era of the cowboy that we hear so much about. Bad weather is one, so drought, and also there's a big blizzard that ends up killing off like 90% of the cattle. Overgrazing, so there's not enough grass, and barbed wire, because if you think about it, with the invention of barbed wire, they can enclose the herds, so they don't need cowboys to wrangle them out across the frontier and push them toward the terminal. They can keep them in with barbed wire. So these cowboys of folklore, their days were short-lived, but they make for some good Western movies. Farmers, they need a way to get people to move out to the west. So they passed the Homestead Act, which allows 160 acres of free land to settlers. So if you're a poor family living in New York City, if you would just make the trip, if you're willing to go, there are 160 free acres of land waiting for you. It sounds too good to be true, and it was, because the conditions were you had to live on it for a certain number of years, you had to improve the land, and then you'd be able to keep it. So it was only free if you met these conditions. The problem was the land was awful. Like, it's dry, you can't grow anything on it. So most of the people who move out to these homesteads end up abandoning them because they can't even grow anything on them in the first place. So these, I like this picture. I don't know who these people are, but they were a nice little frontier band. But I picked this because of the housing in the back. You can see these are called soddies. If you've ever driven through the plains, like western Kansas, there's not a whole lot of trees or materials, so they have to build their houses out of sod. That's why they're called soddies. So they're kind of built into like a hill, and that's what they look like. They say that the 100th meridian, which is like a line of longitude, is the end of farmable land. So once you cross that point, east of Salina, Kansas, there's no way you're going to grow anything unless you get really creative, which is what they have to do, and figure out irrigation techniques, dams, and ways to get water to your crops. So most of these people have a really tough time once they move out to the plains, to the frontier, to try to grow things. So the far west comes of age. We get a bunch of new western states. Obviously, people are moving to these territories. Once you have enough people, you can apply to be a state. In Oklahoma, this is just kind of an interesting thing. They have a land rush, which is where I was someday in April something, 1889, you line up with your horse, and when they say go, you take off and you go claim what piece of land you want. It's a mad dash. There's a Tom Cruise movie called Far and Away that has a scene of this in it, and it's really good. If you haven't seen that before, you should watch it. So the Sooners, that's how they get their nickname, the football team. They go too soon, they jump the gun, and try to claim their plots of land before they're allowed to. So that's where the football team gets their name, or the school. So the land rush, they're trying to claim up their plots of land in these western states. Really, really important. So in your notes, note sheet, put a star by this, highlight this. By 1890, so about 25 years after the Civil War, the frontier is out of room. We've gone as far west as we can go with the Homestead Act. We've settled most of that western territory. So this guy writes a really important, I say book, it's more of like an essay, called The Significance of the Frontier in American History. The short name for that, and if you see a question on the AP exam about this, it will probably call it the Frontier Thesis, Jackson's Frontier Thesis, where basically he argues this is the end of an era. Since the beginning of America, the frontier has provided this outlet for the cities. It was kind of part of who we are, this whole westward expansion. Now that period is over, so our mindset is going to have to shift. Later, we'll talk about this is one factor that leads to imperialism, where we start looking outward, see who else we can take over, Hawaii, Cuba, the Philippines. Also leads to the conservation movement. Before this point, we hadn't really been careful about keeping our natural resources. So the first national parks are founded. Yellowstone is first, followed by Yosemite. And the safety valve theory is kind of what I was saying. Like, the frontier had always been this safety valve that if the cities got too crowded, or if you just hated your life in the cities, you could move out west. There was always that option. But now that we've settled it all, where do we go from here? So it's just a question about the identity of the United States and how we move forward. Now down south. So we left off with the South on Reconstruction, totally destroyed, trying to rebuild. White Redeemer Democrats are going to come retake over the legislature. So this new South is a term, it was a group of people who wanted the South to industrialize. So they were picturing like factories and railroads all over the South so that they would not have to rely on the North for all of that stuff. So they offer tax exemptions to try to get businesses and factories to come into the South. There is some success. We know it's going to stay mostly agricultural, but in Birmingham, Alabama, it becomes a big steel focus. Georgia, the Carolinas, they have textile factories and end up even having more than some of the places in the North. So we do see huge growth in the South in population, industry, railroads. We know the North is still going to have the bulk of that. And many of the profits, things that are created in the South, are going to profit Northern banks and financiers. So the poverty in the South remains. Agriculture is going to remain the cornerstone of their economy, even though we do see this new South attempt to try to shift to industry. Also in the South, we have birth of Jim Crow. So we know when the Compromise of 1877 was signed, Hayes is given the presidency in exchange for taking the troops out of the South. That ends Reconstruction and allows white Redeemer Democrats in the South to retake control. That's what we call these people who were really, many of them white supremacists, trying to regain control in the South. They start Jim Crow laws, which I'm sure you have heard of. These are the laws that separate people by race. So this is going to go on for a long time. Some of your grandparents may even remember seeing signs like this in the South. So different restrooms, different water fountains, sections of seating in buses and movie theaters, all of that comes from these Jim Crow laws. Really important court case, Plessy versus Ferguson. Little context here, this is Homer Plessy. He is 1/16th African American. He gets on an all whites train car in Louisiana, and he knows what he's doing. Like, he knows that he's probably going to be arrested. The point was to bring it to the courts, thinking they would get a favorable outcome, but it backfires. They rule in Plessy versus Ferguson that separate but equal is okay. It's okay to have two restrooms as long as they're equal. We know that is never really the case. They're not ever equal, but that is the court case that says Jim Crow is fine. This is going to be overturned in the 1950s. This is like the start of the civil rights movement, or part of it, in the South, by the Brown versus Board, which leads to the Central High crisis just right down the road in Little Rock. So Plessy versus Ferguson says it's okay to have separate but equal. Two really important guys you need to know, Booker T. Washington and W.E.B. Du Bois. So these two both want racial equality, but have very different views on how to achieve that. So this is Booker T. Washington. He is a former slave, which their backgrounds can tell you a lot about their point of view on this issue and why they thought the way they did. So he founds the Tuskegee Institute. His big push was to learn a practical skill, mechanical, agricultural skills, and that's what his institute focused on. And that would lead to economic stability, for the African American community, and eventually that would get them to social equality. So he is all about patience. Be patient, just wait. He has this Atlanta Compromise speech where he talks about that we need to be patient and learn a skill, and eventually equality will come. On the other side of that is W.E.B. Du Bois, who is the first African American to get a PhD from Harvard. He is from the North, born and raised, was never enslaved. He says, no, we're not going to wait and be patient and learn how to farm so that maybe one day white people will respect us. That's not going to happen. So he pushes for immediate mainstreaming, has this idea what he calls the talented 10th. So you take the top 10% of the African American community and you push them into the best colleges, political office, the best jobs, so that equality will happen sooner rather than later, which in his opinion is what Booker T. Washington is okay with. So that is the difference in the two. This cartoon, I think, really helps people remember the difference if you're a visual person. So Booker T. Washington is here with overalls and a shovel, saying that if you just work hard, economic equality will lead to social equality. On the other side is Du Bois, who is also going to be one of the founders of the NAACP, forgot to mention that, with a bow tie and a briefcase, trying to promote education, business, equality right away. So know the difference in those two. We'll probably do some more stuff with them because they're really important. All right, last part here talks about farming, how farming is changing and the issues that the farmers are facing. So specialization to cash crops is going to become popular. We know the farms are tied to banking and railroads because if you're going to be able to move your crops to sell them, you have to use the railroads. And the railroads know that, so they can abuse the farmers and charge ridiculous amounts. Also, machinery is going to become very expensive. There's new technology for farming that's going to come about with the second industrial revolution. We see these massive wheat farms called bonanza farms in large California estates. So it's like a shift, just like we saw with factories, the shift to big business, shift to big farming. It's not local farmer Joe growing just enough for his family. It's these massive farming conglomerates that really control the whole industry. Problems for farmers. So you got to feel bad for the farmers. Things were not going well. Rarely does it seem like in US history things are going really well for the farmers. It seems like there's always something. So debt and deflation on the prices around the world, so they're not getting as much money for their crops as they had been previously. There's not enough money to go around. These are going to be some of the ones calling for silver to be used in addition to gold. Their farms are getting foreclosed on. They have ridiculous interest rates. So many of them, white and black farmers in the South, resort to tenant farming or sharecropping because they can't afford to own their own farm. This is an auction. There's people sitting on the roof here to bid on this farm that has been foreclosed. So they're angry. It makes sense why they would be upset. So angry farmers. Other issues, poor farmers, grasshoppers, boll weevils, like UAM, if you're going to Monticello, that's your mascot. They're destroying crops, so pests are an issue. There's floods, there's droughts, you have to worry about the weather. There's high taxes. We know farmers don't like tariffs. We've talked about that. Someone's always mad about the tariffs, and if they're high, the farmers don't like it. Railroads are overcharging them, and it seems like everybody else has a trust. So like railroads have a trust. Oil, these are like those monopolies that join together. Even the workers up north have labor unions where they can get together and collectively bargain for their rights. The farmers don't have that. They're isolated, they're spread out from each other, and they feel like they're all alone. So they're going to try to remedy that. First group that is formed is called the Grange. I know that's a really weird name, but that is the name of the farmer club. So think of them like the farmersonly.com of the late 1800s. Founder is Oliver H. Kelly. The idea behind it is we need somewhere to vent, to come together, to socialize. It really is like a club, like a social club, where they're like, hey, that's not fair what the railroads are doing to us. You're right, we should do something about that. So it's farmers getting together. This will lead into farmers' alliances. Eventually, the Populist Party is going to form as a political party, like the Farmer Political Party, and it really does have quite a bit of influence. So there's Oliver H. Kelly there. Granger laws. So this is what the Grange is able to pass, where they're going to regulate the railroads. So some of them end up being reversed, but it is a good first step. So it would make it to where they can't overcharge farmers for a short haul. Like some of them were charging insane amounts to take grain 10 miles where it would be cheaper to take it 100 miles. It just didn't make sense. So some of these laws are finally starting to put the railroads in check so they can't just do whatever they want to the poor farmers. Last thing here, Interstate Commerce Act, which creates the Interstate Commerce Commission. Those are like one and the same. This is the first federal effort to regulate the railroads. It doesn't work very well. Same as like the Sherman Antitrust Act, eventually the Clayton Antitrust Act. These attempts by the government to regulate big business are tricky because these men are millionaires, they're robber barons because they're smart and they figure out ways around a lot of this stuff. So they're attempting to curb things like rates and pools and rebates, these sneaky things that railroads do that are harming the farmers. So this is not all that effective, but it's a step in the right direction. When we get to Roosevelt, Teddy Roosevelt and Taft, we'll see a lot more of this trust busting where they're trying to control big business and get them in check and remind them you are not in charge, the government is in charge, not big business. So that was it for chapter 17. Please let me know if you have any questions or comments or thoughts, and I hope everybody has a great day.